I want to welcome you to this opening lecture of our second Elul Zman or Elul cycle that we have here at Project Zug, preparing us for the high holy days and going into the holiest time of our year. My name is Eliza Abalafia. I am zooming in from Albany, New York, and I'm the user coordinator at Project Zug. So you probably have gotten some emails from me. You might have seen my name on the website or in correspondence, and I'm here to support you in your learning at Project Zug, whether that means helping with the tech or any questions you might have in your learning. I'm here to support you, to help you deepen your learning, and to really enable you to be a part of this amazing online learning community. Sorry, my computer is being a little finicky. So this is the Elul cycle. Not all of our cycles are like this, as you probably know. Sometimes our cycles are just all of our courses, but this is a really special situation because we're learning the same course all at the same time. And we get to have Rabbi Shai held come and teach at the beginning and the end to close out our learning. And in the chat, I see that many of you are already saying hi, which I love. And so if you haven't already, please drop in the chat where you're zooming in from. It is so, so special to feel connected to where everyone's coming from. And while you're doing that, I'm just going to give a little plug for our High Holiday Reader. You could have signed up for it when you registered, but if you haven't already, our High Holiday Reader is beautiful, beautiful Torah from our faculty, from people in our community, and it is delivered to you to your door in a beautiful booklet. So if you're interested in that, Adi is going to drop a link in the chat, and you'll be able to order that. The deadline is tomorrow. Okay, and so just before we get started tonight, also, why don't, if you would like to sort of warm us up, if you want to drop in the chat to get us thinking, what is Teshuvah for you? And then Rabbi Shai Held will really expand on that, I think. Yeah, and so that's it for me. If you have any questions about Zug or my work or how you can get more involved in Hadar Project Zug, you're welcome to email me. I'll drop my email in the chat. And now I'm going to pass it on to Rabbi Shai Held, the teacher and developer of this course, and let him begin his teaching.
Thank you, Eliza. Good evening, everyone. Good to see so many familiar faces and also a lot of new ones, which is very exciting for me. I want to begin by making an observation, if I could, which is that if you ask most Jewishly engaged Jews what Teshuvah is, you're likely to hear that it's about repenting for sinful behaviors. That's what many of us were taught in school. That's how many of us conceptualize what Teshuvah is. We come before God asking forgiveness for having done X or Y and seeking to have our slates wiped clean and our lives renewed. But in fact, traditionally speaking, there are two strands of Teshuvah. One is repentance for behaviors we have engaged in, but two is repentance for problematic character traits we have acquired. Like Jewish ethics more broadly, in other words, Teshuvah is about both conduct and character, actions as well as attributes. That is, I think, really fundamental to understanding what the project of Teshuvah is all about. And it's the latter, Teshuvah about character, and the mitzvah to cultivate and develop good character more generally, that I want to focus on together this evening. Okay, and with that, let's scroll to source number one. Maimonides, the Rambam, in the 7th chapter of the Laws of Teshuvah, Maimonides was the first person, he may have been the second, but he was effectively the first in the history of Jewish thought who took an array of rabbinic teachings about Teshuvah from different places, as well as his own philosophical commitments, and wove them into a halachic unit called Hilchot Teshuvah. The very existence of something called Hilchot Teshuvah, the laws of repentance, is an innovation of Maimonides. And in the 7th chapter of the laws of Teshuvah, he says the following really interesting thing. He says, Al Tomar. Tomar in rabbinic Hebrew can mean say or think. So don't say or don't think. She'ein tshuva ela me'averot sheyesh bahen ma'aseh. Don't think that tshuva only applies to sins that involve action. Kigon znut v'gezel u'gneva. That is, such as sexual impropriety, robbery, or theft. But rather, ela, he says, kishem shetzarich adam lashuv me'elu, just as a person must repent from these, so also a person must search out problematic character traits. Deot here does not mean opinions as it does in modern Hebrew. It means, for Maimonides here, character traits. Just as one searches out one's deeds, one must search out one's character traits. V'lashuv, and to repent from min hakaas, from anger, umin ha'eva, from hatred, min hakin'ah, from envy and jealousy, umina hitul, from frivolity, mirdifat hamamon, from being obsessed with chasing money, v'hakavod, or being obsessed with chasing honor, umirdifat hamachalot, and from gluttony, v'chayotze bahen, and all other vicious behaviors, not vicious in the sense of cruel, but vicious from the word vice, those behaviors that are the opposite of virtue but are vice. Min hakol tzarich lachzor b'tshuva. You have to do tshuva, says Maimonides, from all of these character traits. Now, notice something before I go on to the next line of Maimonides. Anytime a thinker tells you don't say X or don't think X, you immediately know what? That some people think or say X, right? Maimonides says, don't think Teshuvah is only about actions. He's responding to the fact that he knows that some people, in fact, think Teshuvah is only about actions. Says Maimonides, no, it is also about these attributes, such as the one he's listed. And then he points out, in a kind of sober psychological observation, and these sins, these characterological sins, are more difficult than simply actions. Why? Because when a person is submerged, notice that language, when a person is submerged in them, it is very hard to leave them behind. Once I've established anger as part of my identity, once I have established jealousy as part of my identity, it is doubly hard to leave an attribute behind. V'chein hu omer, as scripture says, Ya'azov rasha darko, let the wicked man abandon his ways, v'ish aven machshavotav, and the sinful person also his thoughts, that is one's inner life. So Maimonides here makes the simple but really powerful point that repentance is not only for actions, but it is also for attributes. Now, I think it is important to say that character is important for Maimonides, not just because it's instrumentally significant to shaping conduct. In other words, it is not important to be compassionate simply because it leads me to compassionate action. It is important intrinsically and on its own terms. What my character traits are is inherently a virtue, a value in and of itself. Okay? So if someone were to say to me, what kind of person are you? I am, for Maimonides, I don't only answer ideally by describing what I do, but I also answer by describing what character traits that I have. Now, if we scroll down to sources 2 and 3, these are sources that are probably familiar to many people. Probably many of you have learned these sources with me because they form an important part of a lot of the teaching that I do. But here, I wanted to direct your attention to one particular lens on this. You know, on the one hand, Jewish sources say we have to work on character. On the other hand, or not on the other hand, really on the same hand, they try to guide us as to which character traits are particularly important to acquire, and conversely, which character traits are extremely important to put down. So when it comes to the character traits to acquire, we have these two passages that I want to briefly, just really briefly read together. These are, we could spend many hours on these, but I want to just sort of note why this is important. Lalechet bechol drachav, the Midrash Sifrei, this is by the Tanaim, the same people who brought you the Mishnah. They say, what does it mean to walk in all God's ways? And they quote a verse from Joel, V'haya kol asher yikarei b'shem Hashem yimaleh, and whosoever shall be called by the name of the Lord will be saved, which elicits the obvious question, how can anyone be called by the name of the Lord? What could that possibly mean? Right? I would never call someone Lord. Ella, but rather, Nikra makom rachum, just as God is called merciful, so should you be merciful. God is called gracious, that is giving gifts, giving things that God does not owe, so also should you be. Just as God is righteous, so should you be, tzaddik. Just as God is chassid, generous, kind, so should you be. So in other words, what it means to be called by the name of God is to be called by the same attributes that God is called by. And that is here, for this rabbinic text, that is specifically an emphasis on love, mercy, and compassion. The kind of person I'm supposed to be is not merely, although it is obviously also someone who does loving things, but it is also someone who is loving in character. And now scroll down to source 3 for a minute. This is the source I want to pair with it. The Talmud Bavli, again, asks the question, what does it mean to walk after the Lord your God? Only this time it gives a list not of character traits, but of actions. Just as God clothes the naked, so should you. Just as God visits the sick, so should you. Just as God comforted the mourner, so should you. And just as God buried the dead, so should you. Now, what I want to observe is that these two sources provide extremely important correctives for one another. That is to say, for misreadings of one another. Lest you read the first source and say, Judaism only cares about my attitude. You know, I'm compassionate, I care about people. But it doesn't care about what I actually do. Comes to source in the Talmud and says, compassion that is not manifest concretely in the world is not compassion at all. It's just, you know, enjoying my own emotional life. But conversely, lest I think that all that matters is that I pay a shiva call or come to a funeral, says the Midrash, no, it also matters profoundly who I am in doing those things. Who I am in doing those things. Am I a person who cares in that moment or merely a person who shows up because it's expected of me? Now, I want to observe also here that the virtue, and we'll see why I'm emphasizing this in just a moment, the virtue that we're being commended here, that is being commended to us here, is compassion rather than pity. Pity is fundamentally reaching down to someone. It is a posture that I call a vertical posture, whereas compassion is horizontal. When I'm compassionate towards someone, I reach across to them rather than down to them. I am not above them. The difference between compassion and pity, if you want, is that in compassion, I am aware of my own vulnerability. In pity, I foster the illusion that I'm invulnerable. Oh, that happened to you. That's terrible for you. Could never happen to me because I'm better than that. I'm impervious. That's pity, not compassion. Okay? Now, let's scroll down for a moment to source 4. Maimonides, in the Sefer HaMitzvot, in his collection of the 613 commandments, he says one thing that I wanted you to see, basically based on these two rabbinic sources. These two sources about love and compassion. The first one about compassionate attributes, the second one about compassionate action. He says in the 5th line of the Hebrew, in the middle of the 5th line of the Hebrew, and then let's just do that because I can't see both at the same time. He says, She'inyano lehidamot ba'peulot hatovot vehamidot hachashuvot she'ituar bahem. We are commanded to become similar to emulate peulot hatovot, the good actions, the good deeds, and hamidot hachashuvot. Chashuvot here is not important as in modern Hebrew, but I would say something like elevated or exalted. We are commanded in the mitzvah of walking in God's ways, both to behave in certain ways and to cultivate certain character traits. I'm going to develop this more in just a moment, okay? Now, one more source for Maimonides, which is just kind of interesting for those of you interested in how Jewish thought wrestles with anthropomorphism and non-anthropomorphism. Let's scroll to source 5, okay? Maimonides is going to say in Hilchot Deot, these are the laws of character traits. Maimonides develops, these are, it's very closely related to Hilchot Teshuvah, the laws of cultivating character effectively. And here's what he says, Kach limdu beferush mitzvazo. This is what our sages taught in explaining the mitzvah of walking in God's ways. Mahuni kra chanun, just as God is called gracious, afataya chanun, just as we saw in the Talmud. Mahuni kra rachum, just as God is called merciful, afataya rachum. Mahuni kra kadosh, afataya kadosh, just as God is called holy, so you should be holy. This is Maimonides commenting here on Leviticus. The passage that we saw was all about compassion. Maimonides has here added holiness. But now he says something interesting. V'al derech zo, karu haniviim la'el, b'chol otan hakinuyim, erech apayim v'rav chesed, tzadik v'yashar, tamim, gibor v'chazak. So the prophets called God by all of these names, long-suffering, abundant in love, righteous, honest, pure, strong, mighty, etc. Lahodia shehem drachim tovim b'yisharim v'chayav adam lahnig atzmo b'han v'lidamot elav k'fi kocho. Maimonides here says something really interesting. He says the sages call God these things because that's the way that's available to them to show us that these are the attributes that we should strive to embody in the world. In other words, for Maimonides, it is not important that God actually have these attributes. It is important that we say that God have these attributes. That is because Maimonides is very nervous about anthropomorphism. Other Jewish thinkers will say, no, what do you mean? God is loving. God is merciful. God is compassionate. Those are not just things we say, but those are things that are in fact true, however much we have to struggle with what we mean by that language when we apply it to God. But Maimonides here is saying, even the theology is a way of talking about the attributes that are important for us to embody and instantiate in the world. When we say that God is compassionate, again, according to Maimonides, not according to most Jewish thinkers, when we say that God is compassionate, what we're really saying is compassion is an ideal we should strive for. For other Jewish thinkers, we're saying two things, both that God really is compassionate and that compassion is an ideal we should strive for. Okay, now let me stop walking through these sources for a minute and try to kind of contextualize and think together about what's going on here. The claim here that underlies everything that we've seen so far is that in Jewish ethics, motives matter. Many of you have heard me talk in the past about what a crime it is that so many people have heard it said by rabbis from pulpits or by teachers in Hebrew schools or whatever it might be, that Judaism doesn't care about what you feel, it only cares about what you do. This is profoundly and preposterously false, right? Judaism cares profoundly not just about my visiting the sick, but about who I am when I visit the sick. Do I visit a sick person begrudgingly or do I visit them lovingly? Or in a very important Talmudic passage, the reward of tzedakah depends on how much love is in the deed. How much love is in the deed. If I give someone, or to give another example, which is slightly different, if I give someone tzedakah, but I refuse to make eye contact with them, it's as if I did nothing. There's some way about who am I in the act of giving. Or if I want to say this perhaps in a more radical way, do I visit the sick only because it's my duty or because I care about you? As we'll soon see, Rambam, and after him much of Jewish ethics, embraces Aristotle more than Kant. And I'll explain what that means in just a minute. Okay? Here's an example from modern moral theory. This has nothing to do with Judaism, at least explicitly, but it's a very helpful example. Imagine, God forbid, you're lying in the hospital, you're feeling really sick, your friend comes to visit you, and for the first time in weeks, you start to feel hopeful, you find yourself laughing, you remember, oh, I'm actually still alive, it's okay. And then when your friend finally gets up to leave, you say, thank you so much, it means so much to me that you came. And your friend says, oh, don't thank me, I was obligated to come. Most likely, like most people, you would be offended by that. You came because you're obligated? I wanted you to come because you love me. I wanted you to come because you care about me and I'm sick. There is some sense in which someone who says, don't thank me, I came because I'm obligated, isn't just tactless, but they're also revealing a defect in what motivates them to engage in a moral action. They are revealing of a defect. And that suggests that morally, motives matter, and we want people to be motivated in the interpersonal sphere by love and compassion and care. So to give you a sense of where we are in this progression, Maimonides said Teshuvah is also about, not just about action, but also about attributes. And what I'm suggesting here is that not all attributes are equal. In many ways, the most important attributes we can possibly cultivate, according to Jewish ethics, are the ones that are associated with walking in God's ways, namely compassion, mercy, love, kindness, etc. Let me give you another example of this that some of you might find entertaining from the philosopher Iris Murdoch. Iris Murdoch describes the case, and you have to keep in mind here that Iris Murdoch is British, which I think adds to this case, of the very proper mother-in-law who is introduced to her son's love. And she finds this young woman just very boorish, not very sophisticated, not very elegant, not very refined. But because this mother-in-law is an extremely refined person herself, she treats the young woman perfectly. But meanwhile, inside, she has somewhere between hostility and disdain for her. And then over many years, she comes to realize that this young woman is actually a wonderful person and has done wonders for her son and is just the perfect spouse for him. Being perfectly proper, she treats her externally exactly how she used to. What Iris Murdoch asks is, are we really willing to say that nothing morally significant has happened over these years where the woman's attitude has changed? Because after all, her actions were good then, and her actions are good now. But of course, Iris Murdoch argues, in fact, something very significant has happened, which is that the way I see another person has changed. My motives are different. What animates me and motivates me is different. And that is a morally significant change. And that means that motives, what motivates me when I act, really is, in fact, quite significant. Now, with that in mind, we're ready to look at the sixth source, which we will, in the interest of time, we will not read inside. I brought you some sources here that I'm only going to talk about, but I wanted to bring them at length for you so that you could study them with your chavruta if it becomes appropriate and you find the time. Rabbi Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg, one of the great 20th century decision makers, halachic decision makers, asks the question, why is it that we don't make a bracha when we engage in an interpersonal mitzvah? Before a mitzvah ben adam lechavero, before I give tzedakah or visit someone in the hospital, I don't say Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam asher kitshanu mitzvotav v'tzivanu al bikur cholim or al matat tzedakah. I don't say that. Why? And there are many possible reasons. And Weinberg offers one that I think is astonishingly beautiful. What Weinberg says is, we don't say a bracha before we engage in an interpersonal mitzvah, because if we did, we would be instilling the wrong motivation. If I stopped outside of a hospital room and said, "Blessed are you, God, who commanded me to do this," then I would instill in myself the sense that I'm visiting the sick because I have to. Whereas in fact, I should visit the sick because I want to. I should be motivated by love and not merely by obligation. Obligation is the wrong motivation. So a bracha that emphasizes obligation would lead me far afield. This is a really kind of astonishing claim, right? I should be motivated here. If someone were to stop me and say, why did you go visit Stephen Greenfield? God forbid. Stephen, why did you go visit Stephen Greenfield in the hospital? The answer should be because he's sick and I care about him. Not because it's a mitzvah. What I would say, by the way, if this is helpful to anyone, is for Maimonides, the mitzvah is to work on myself so that I become the kind of person who in the moment doesn't require a mitzvah. I have to become the kind of person who responds spontaneously to someone who's sick by responding lovingly. In the moment when you're in the hospital, I don't think, oh, I'm obligated. I think, oh, you're sick. That's the beautiful argument that Weinberg wants to make. And he bases this on his interpretation of source 7, which I brought you at some length because I thought some of you might like studying it together. This is one of the most amazing essays in medieval Jewish thinking, really in the history of Jewish ethics. Maimonides essentially does the following, okay? Maimonides says this: I have a problem. My problem is that Aristotle and the rabbis of the Talmud appear to disagree about how ethics works, and that can't be. Just take a minute to think about that for a minute, right? Maimonides unself-consciously simply says this up. Aristotle says one thing, the sages of the Talmud say another. They seem to contradict, but they can't contradict because they're both true. What's the contradiction? Aristotle says that I should never want to do bad things. My motive should be pure, such that it would never cross my mind to steal or mug or attack. But the sages in a famous midrash say, I don't want to do this mitzvah, but what can I do? My Father in heaven has commanded me. And Maimonides says, how can there be this contradiction between Aristotle and Maimonides? I'm sorry, between Aristotle and the Talmudic sages. How can Aristotle say, I should never want to do the bad, and the rabbis say, I should want to do the bad and not do it because God commands me? And Maimonides' synthesis is breathtaking. He says, in fact, there is no disagreement between Aristotle and the rabbis. In fact, if you pay close attention, he says, the rabbis, when they say, I wish I could commit this sin, but I can't because God has forbidden me, are only talking about ritual commandments, about mitzvot ben adam lamakom. They are talking about things like eating pig. But nowhere do the sages say, oh, I wish I could mug Mona Fishbane, but I won't because it's forbidden. Because to have the desire to mug someone is to reflect a failure of character, a defect of character. The very urge, oh, I wish I could murder my next door neighbor, but I won't. You know why? Because halacha says it's forbidden. That's a defective character. The very impulse to do that suggests a shortcoming. So Maimonides' synthesis is to say everyone agrees that when it comes to ethics, when it comes to the interpersonal, the ideal motive is not to want to hurt another person, not to want to do the wrong. Rituals are a different thing. I remember when I first got married, my wife said to me one Sunday morning, we were walking in the hallway of our apartment building and it smelled like bacon, which I have never eaten in my life. And I said to her, I hate that smell. And my wife turned to me and said, you are so parochial. What you should say is, God, that smells amazing, but I can't have it. And although I don't suggest you do this in your marriage, I said, oh, you're a Maimonidean. That was a little bit, very romantic, as you can tell. But the point is something very, very moving about this, which is, it is not the case that I should spend my life having the inclination to do morally terrible things and then say, oh, but I won't do them because halacha forbids it. No, that's not the kind of character I should have. The kind of character I should cultivate in myself is such that I can't imagine doing that. I would attack someone, I would hurt someone, I would speak badly about them. Of course not. Now, if this is helpful for people, I'll just say a philosopher named Bob Roberts has this really helpful way of thinking about the history of philosophy. He says there are two ways that people tend to think about moral greatness. One is the model of saintliness, and the other is the model of heroism. Heroism is, oh, I would really like to mug you, but the law says I can't, so I won't. The hero is the one who captures her inclinations and doesn't do what she's inclined to do. But the saint is the person who says, mug you? I could never mug you. I can't even contemplate doing such a thing. The saint is the person who doesn't need to capture her inclinations because her inclinations have been purified. What I'm suggesting here is that Maimonidean ethics and Jewish ethics more broadly is an ethics of saintliness rather than heroism. And that might be surprising to a lot of people who have been taught things like it is better one who is commanded and does something than one who is not commanded and does it. But that refers, as Weinberg points out, to different kinds of mitzvot, namely mitzvot ben adam lemakom, mitzvot between a person and God. Okay? All right. Now, let's go a little bit further. I want to shift gears and come at this whole question of Teshuvah for character. So far, we saw Maimonides say that Teshuvah is about character, rooting out bad character traits, instilling good ones. We emphasized at great length the centrality of mercy, compassion, and love. But now I want to think about this question of doing Teshuvah for character traits from a slightly different lens. Let's scroll down to source 9, if you would. Thank you. As you can see, I gave you a whole long text here to study. Source 9. I'm sorry, source 8, I should have said. Okay. Now, Teshuvah, according to some thinkers influenced by Maimonides, is not really only about instilling certain character traits. It is about fundamentally reshaping our identity, becoming someone other than I was before. The most extreme formulation of this that I know is from Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik's classic work, Halachic Man. He says the following rather extreme thing. It's a source 8. The most fundamental principle of all in Judaism is that man must create himself. It is this idea that Judaism introduced into the world. This is a rather existentialist reading of the Jewish tradition. If I said to you, based on everything you've ever learned about Judaism, what is the idea that Judaism is introduced into the world? I'm not sure you would all jump up and say, oh, that the human being must create herself. But that's Soloveitchik's argument. And then he goes on to say this really rather dramatic thing. Repentance, according to the halachic, the Jewish legal view, is an act of creation, self-creation, the severing of one's psychic identity with one's previous I, and the creation of a new I, possessor of a new consciousness, a new heart and spirit, different desires, longings, goals. This is the meaning of that repentance compounded of regret over the past, and resolve for the future. Sorry about that typo. I totally missed that. So this is actually really important here. His argument is that what Teshuvah is fundamentally the kind of transformation that means I am not the same person that I was before I engage in the process of Teshuvah. He uses this image that I have to say I find rather disturbing, the severing of one's psychic identity with one's previous I, which strikes me as somewhat terrifying, right? But I understand what he's trying to say, which is, it's not just, oh, yesterday I did this, today I do that. It's, I'm not the same person I was yesterday. But the question that I would ask about this is it realistic and is it possible? Because one thing that we should be cautious about texts and thinkers that say Teshuvah is about fashioning an entirely new self is that we set people up for one of two very big dangers. One is despair. I tried to change myself into a new I, but you know what? I woke up on the morning after Yom Kippur, jealous and petty, just like I was before. So the whole thing must be a failure. So there's one possibility is despair. And the other possibility, which is at least as dangerous, is I lie to myself. Oh, Teshuvah, I engage in Teshuvah. I'm not angry at all. I always like to say, you all know somebody who thinks of themselves as very spiritually developed and very peaceful and loving. And meanwhile, they're like a simmering pot of rage right under the surface. You've all met somebody like that. And the danger is that if you tell people, oh, Teshuvah means you can become a totally different person, there's a temptation to somehow convince myself that I'm someone that I was not. So this makes me nervous. But I want to suggest something else, if I may, which is not only that it makes me nervous, but I think it actually cuts against the way most Jewish sources read what Teshuvah is and isn't capable of enacting. So look at sources 9 and 10. Sources 9 and 10, Deuteronomy contains this totally fascinating tension. Deuteronomy chapter 10 commands the people, Umaltemet orlat levavchem ve'orpechem lo takshu od. You should circumcise your hearts. JPS here translates it rather delicately, cut away the thickening about your hearts. But circumcising your hearts means cutting away the parts of you that are hardened, that are impenetrable, that are impregnable, right? And give up your stubbornness. And then just 20 chapters later, Deuteronomy says something else. God will circumcise your heart. And so the reader is left to wonder, the reader of Deuteronomy, well, which one is it? Am I commanded to circumcise my heart, or will God circumcise my heart? Now, it's possible to reconcile these two, because after all, Deuteronomy 30 envisions some repentance on the people's part. So maybe I have to start and God has to finish. But nevertheless, as I try to show and argue in the Heart of Torah, which is source 11, as I try to argue there, you need both human effort and divine assistance. You need both human will and divine grace. Whoever named that TV show Will and Grace was actually very clever and probably knew something about philosophy. Will is what human beings can do by themselves. Grace is what we depend on God for. In other words, what Soloveitchik does not do is reckon with Deuteronomy chapter 30 sufficiently. Do me a favor, mute yourself if you're not muted. Okay? So there's this is actually really, really important. Deuteronomy here introduces a note of sobriety. I, God, command you to soften your hearts, but I know that you won't be able to entirely do it yourself. You will need my help. There is a debate, I think, that runs through the whole history of Jewish thought. And here I'm using an idea developed by the Israeli philosopher Rav Shagar, that some people say Teshuvah is all about human freedom. It is cherut. It is about the unlimited capacity of human beings to change who and what we are. The two great advocates of this view are Maimonides and Rabbi Soloveitchik. And then there's a view that says Teshuvah is actually about chesed. It's about a grace that God bestows upon us. I can't change myself into a new person. To the extent that that's possible at all, it's because I need help doing it, and God helps. That, I think, is Deuteronomy, or Deuteronomy 30 at least, right? I, God, will help you. Why am I saying all this? Because I think on the one hand, I'm inviting us to think about the ways in which Teshuvah is about working on my character, shaping who I am, and knowing that it is not about making demands that are actually impossible. It is not about, oh, here, sever your psychic identity with your previous I. It is do everything you can and know the limits sometimes, know and admit the moments when you feel like you can't, and ask for help. Now, subtly, I think, the Bible offers us an illustration of this point that I have been making. If you look at source 12, Psalm 51 is a psalm that is traditionally connected to David after the sin with Bathsheba. David commits two very egregious sins rolled into one, adultery and murder. But in this psalm, he says something really interesting. He says, Leif tahor birali Elohim. Create a pure heart for me, O God. Now, here is the interesting thing. Birah, the root bet resh aleph, refers in the Bible to the kind of creation that only God can do. God and human beings can both be yotzer, a different meaning for creation, but only God can be borei. Only God can create in this way. And it is really striking that in this psalm, David, or whoever the psalmist is, says, create a new soul for me, God. That is to say, I can't create a new self. For that, I need you. So to be anachronistic, I would say Psalm 51 is offering us a critique of Rabbi Soloveitchik, but much more importantly, Psalm 51 is saying to us, some of the most profound changes, ultimately, we need help for. And then we can talk about, this is its own discussion. Well, to what extent do you think God is active in this way or not? One of the reasons Maimonides insists on Teshuvah as whatever human beings can make of ourselves is that he doesn't believe that God helps people. He doesn't believe in the kind of God who's involved in the world. So all there is what I make of myself. That's what there is. But for the psalmist, it's Lev tahor birali Elohim. I need you. In order for me to become a different person than I am, I need help. Again, that is not to exonerate myself from the obligation. It is not, I'm going to let go and let God change me and I'll do nothing. It is decidedly not that. But it is about my taking steps with the consciousness that I may not be able to do it myself. Now, my friend, Professor Richard Middleton, a Bible scholar, makes this really beautiful observation, and it's really the one I want to end with because it brings us right back to the beginning. Middleton makes the really interesting comment that if you think about what David says after the sin with Bathsheba, if you recall the scene when Nathan the prophet comes to him and says, there was a man who stole his neighbor's sheep, etc. And David gets mad, and Natan then says to him, you are the man who did this. And what David says is, Chatati Lashem, I have sinned against God. That's the entirety of his teshuvah, according to the text. And on one level, there's something very profound about that. He doesn't mince words. He doesn't use the passive voice. Mistakes were made. He says, I have sinned against God, and that is a model of repentance. But what Middleton points out is, that's not good enough. Someone who has committed murder and adultery doesn't just need to say, I have sinned. That is, I have committed a bad behavior. He or she or they need to look at themselves and say, who am I that I could behave in this way? What character traits do I have that this is who I am in this moment? I am the kind of person who is capable of adultery and then murder to cover it up. And so Psalm 51 is actually in a kind of intertextual conversation with 2 Samuel. David in 2 Samuel does teshuvah that is inadequate. It is teshuvah that is only about the act he committed. Comes along Psalm 51 and says, but also, David, who are you? Who are you that you have done this? What kind of person am I? David asks. And that is really the point with which we began. That ultimately, teshuvah is not only about the things that I do, but also about the character traits and the attributes that comprise who I am. The question that I want to leave you with, that I hope you'll have opportunity to discuss with your chavruta and with other people in your life, is how do I do this? What does it mean and what does it require to allow teshuvah to go beyond taking responsibility for the things that I've done, which by the way is no small thing on its own terms. But what do I do in order to make it possible for me to go beyond teshuvah for what I've done into teshuvah for the character traits that I know I need to work on, improve, in some cases root out, and in other cases instill? How do I grow in those ways? What do I need in order to grow in those ways? What do I need from myself? What do I need from the people who care about me? What kind of honesty and courage do I need in order to take on the responsibility of fashioning myself? There's a wonderful line, a story attributed to Rabbi to Menachem Mendel of Kutz, the Kutzker Rebbe, that the Kutzker Rebbe, great Hasidic master, is asked, what is the essence of Judaism? And he says, without hesitating, arbet nafzich, working on ourselves. And that's what I want to suggest here in Maimonides and Psalm 51 And sorry, that Maimonides, Psalm 51 is more complicated, but what Maimonides has placed before us, which is work on ourselves, so that not only what we do changes, but also what we are and who we are changes. Okay, thank you very much. I'll take maybe a round of 3 questions, if Aliza, if you have them for me, from if people posted questions. Otherwise, we'll just open up the floor and let people ask.
Hi, yeah, okay. I've sort of gathered some questions into a couple of questions into 2 questions, and then if there's a time for more questions from the chat, people can totally go ahead and do that. So the first one is, there's an assumption in all of this that one can change character and identity. And many modern people might disagree, might feel really rooted in their identity. And what were the rabbis assuming here? That's sort of taking all of the questions from the chat and putting them into one question. So sorry if that was your question and it's a little different. And then another question, what do you mean by grace?
Okay, great. Thank you. So first of all, about the question of that many modern people might be committed to a notion of rigid identity. Here, I actually think that there is something quite, I'll use the word problematic, about believing that identity is fixed, because I think that in many ways, the project of Teshuvah depends on having a notion of identity that is fluid. Now, here's the thing. Many of us would rather have fixed identities, even if those identities are destructive and problematic, than risk what it's like to not know who I am. I'd rather be, I know I'm angry and I have a problem, but I know that's who I am. The process of going from one attribute to another is quite scary, because my identity is in formation at the moment. Imagine someone who says to you, "Who are you?" And you say comfortably, "I'm not sure right now." I think there's something enormously courageous about that. Just as it strikes me as a heresy in Judaism to say the way the world is the way the world has to be, what it means to worship a transcendent God is that every earthly reality is relativized. Nothing is ultimate. No political arrangement, no social arrangement, no economic arrangement. None of it is ultimate. Only God is ultimate. Just as it is a heresy to believe that the way the world is the way the world has to be, so also is it a kind of heresy to believe that the way I am is the way I have to be. That is very dangerous copping out. I think a major part of what Teshuvah is going from saying one thing to the other. The one thing is, I am a person who, when X happens, I respond in way Y, to a different identity, which is in the past, whenever X has happened, I have responded with Y. But whether I will go on doing that is an open question. That's a totally different thing. We have to be willing to let go of believing that our identities are totally fixed. You can't do, there's no such thing as Teshuvah if your identity is totally fixed. Now, what do I mean by grace? So here, I want to say, this is one of the words, and many of you have heard me talk about this, so forgive me. This is one of the words that Jews have tragically and appallingly surrendered to Christians. Grace means that I am not owed something, but I am given it anyway. Life in Judaism is grace, because none of us ever did anything to earn the gifts of life and consciousness. None of us could ever have done anything to earn the gifts of life and consciousness, and yet there they are. That's grace. Grace is when God helps me, even though God doesn't have to help me. Grace is when God gives me a gift, even though God doesn't have to give it to me. Grace is when you show up to my house and show me kindness, even though you don't owe me anything. Grace is when you invite an orphan child into your house for dinner, even though you barely know them and you're not technically obligated. That's grace. That in biblical Hebrew, the word for that is chen. So when the sages say mahu chanun afata, they are saying just as God is gracious, so should you be. Gracious here doesn't mean aren't you gracious the way someone might say in a South Carolina dinner party, right? But rather, I hope I didn't just offend anyone from South Carolina, but that's an expression I associate with people from the South. Grace in the literal sense of I don't owe you something, but I choose to give you something anyway. Maimonides wonderfully understands the phrase olam chesed yibaneh to be the world exists as a function of grace. None of this had to be, but there it is. Okay, Eliza, we can take one more if there are any.
There are
I see there's some conversation I kind of came across the bottom of my screen about what I said about Rabbi Soloveitchik. Were there questions about that?
Not that I see. Does anyone have a question they want to post about?
I have a question. Hello.
Go for it.
Okay.
Okay, this is my question is this: you were using David as an example of Teshuvah in terms of understanding the sin he did, but you also talk about the issue of motivation and character, who he is. And it seems to me what that story says is that he does continue to do tshuva, but it's to a great extent forced on him, I'll say, by circumstances, suffering after one after another until he indeed, his heart is softened.
So, yes. So I that may very well be. Let me just clarify the point I was trying to make, which I think is perhaps a little bit different than that, which is simply that the Psalm, when read in light of 2 Samuel, points to the need for deeper work that David seems to be aware of in 2 Samuel. In 2 Samuel, David is horrified by what he's done and says, I have to do tshuva for my actions. It's only in Psalm 51 that we then hear, wait a minute, I also have to ask who I was that I was capable of acting in such a way. Now, is it true that his process of tshuva is forced on him by circumstance? Yeah, I think that's true, by the way, about many of us much of the time. Think about how often it's actually having someone getting in trouble for something or having someone point a mirror at you that makes you realize, oh my God, this is who I've been. I think about this a lot in terms of American politicians who get in trouble. And let's assume that there have been some politicians who are actually sincere and feel guilty. But it's often public humiliation that elicits that first moment of soul searching. I'm not interested here now in entertaining cynicism and non-cynicism about politics. That's totally not interesting to my point here, right? But the experience of, oh, this is who I am. I'm capable of that. That's really important work. And that goes beyond deeds.
I think I'm thinking about a phrase that Martin Luther King used, was the redemptive power of suffering. That somehow in the suffering, you realize at some point, maybe I deserve this. I got to look harder.
Yeah, I think what I would say about that is what I would say is that, and maybe we'll leave it with this, is that suffering is potentially redemptive. Suffering can also make me less compassionate, less kind, more brutal, right? So I think it's really important to say suffering has redemptive potential in it, but it is not inherently redemptive, right? And that's actually a very Christian way of talking about suffering that I want to resist from a Jewish perspective, because suffering requires a decision. This is, so that for those of you who are familiar with this, I've written about this a lot, about loving the stranger. There's nothing about the experience of suffering in Egypt that means I have to be compassionate. It's a choice that I make about how to let suffering make me more compassionate, right? There's a way in which we are the authors of the memory that in turn becomes the author of us. We shape the memory that in turn shapes us. Here, I think Jewish ethics is a little bit different than Christianity in that it is more hesitant to use the language of redemptive power of suffering without some really important caveats. So I think that it's an important point, but it requires, I think, some let's call it Jewish nuancing.
May I ask a question, Rabbi?
Okay, last word. Yeah.
Yeah. So when you talked about, how do I do this Teshuvah? You said, what do I need from those around me? Which I heard as I'm putting part of my Teshuvah in others' hands, which is, wow, it's hard enough for me to carry out the Teshuvah, then I'm putting it in others' hands. How do you go about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. What I actually meant by that is, do I have people who can support me in the process of tshuva such that I don't feel totally lonely? But of course, in order to let them do that, I have to be willing to be vulnerable with them. And obviously, vulnerability requires wisdom. There are probably some people in your life you shouldn't make yourself super vulnerable to, right? So I'm not suggesting something simplistic here at all. I'm suggesting, I think, that, many of us will find that when it comes to really deep work, we need other people to buoy us, to sort of help us see, oh, I didn't realize I was capable of that. Lo and behold, I was capable of that. Will you remind me that I'm not worthless? I'm just a person who sinned and needs help. Does that help, Adolfo? Is that okay? Great. So I invite you. The sources for tonight, some of the sources that I included were really in the hopes that if you and your chavruta enjoy your learning and want to keep talking about stuff, there's both the Weinberg tshuva, the responsum from Rav Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg, as well as the long essay from Maimonides might be particularly interesting things to talk about, but all of it really. And I hope that this opens up a deeper level of conversation about tshuva, about who we are and not just what we do. And you'll see that some of the sources that I've prepared over the next couple of weeks really try in different ways to probe that very question, tshuva over who I am, and not just tshuva over what I do. Thank you all very much. A very early Shana Tova U'Mitzukah, and enjoy your learning. And I look forward to seeing many of you in a few weeks for the closing lecture. Thank you so much. Good night, everyone.